Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're skipping the long intro and jumping straight into an absolutely fascinating breakdown of a documentary that, frankly, completely reframes everything we know about early human history. We're looking at the agricultural genius of the Nile. It's an incredible deep dive into the African Nile Valley and the sheer scientific brilliance of the people who lived there. So what if the greatest agricultural achievement in human history was just deliberately erased? It's a massive claim, right? But the core premise of our source documentary is exactly that. It argues that the origins of civilization we're typically taught in our textbooks are fundamentally incomplete. Look, long before Roman engineers were building their aqueducts and way before Greek philosophers were debating the origins of farming, the people living along the Nile had already mastered the science of feeding an empire. Let's unpack exactly how they pulled it off. Okay, let's dive into this. The ancient Egyptians called their home Kemet, which translates to the Black Land. And this wasn't just some poetic or symbolic name. It was deeply, deeply scientific. It referred specifically to the exceptionally rich, dark, nitrogen-dense silt left behind by the predictable annual floods of the Nile River. The really crucial point here is that these ancient Africans weren't just incredibly lucky to live near a river. They were highly observant scientists who figured out exactly how to build a complex, sustainable society on top of this literally miraculous soil. To really grasp the magnitude of this, consider the sheer scale of the timeline we're looking at. By 5000 BCE, communities along the Nile were already domesticating plants like emmer wheat and flax right there on African soil. Skip ahead to 3100 BCE, and they had a massive, centralized basin irrigation system running across the entire unified kingdom. And by 750 BCE, Nubian pharaohs were ruling Egypt. We're talking about thousands and thousands of years of continuous, highly sustainable agricultural innovation. These incredible milestones were happening millennia before European colonizers ever even set foot on the continent. They managed all of this using a strictly observed 3-season calendar. You had Akhet, the flood, Perit, the growing season, and Shemu, the harvest. The source details exactly how they harnessed the flood through something called basin irrigation. It's like a giant puzzle. They didn't just sit back and let the water run wild all over the land. Ancient engineers systematically divided the entire floodplain into these massive enclosed earthen basins. During Akhet, the floodwaters were actively directed into these basins and held there for 6 to 8 weeks. This perfectly saturated the soil and locked in all that precious silt before the excess water was drained right back into the river for planting. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer level of scientific understanding required to pull this off year after year. This was absolutely not primitive farming. They had to totally master hydrology. They invented devices like the Nilometer to measure and precisely predict flood levels because, well, too low meant famine and too high meant total destruction. They mastered soil science by planting directly into that mineral-dense silt, and they pioneered crop rotation. By constantly cycling winter wheat, spring legumes, and cotton, they made sure the soil was literally never depleted. It was engineered genius, plain and simple. Section 1. Beyond Egypt, the Kush and Axum empires. You see, this mastery didn't just magically stop at the Egyptian border. Take the kingdom of Kush, centered in modern-day Sudan. They built these things called hafirs, basically massive, highly sophisticated underground cisterns and reservoirs designed to capture rainwater during wet seasons so they could use it during dry periods. But here is the detail from the source that should absolutely blow your mind. The Kushites were among the very first people in human history to smelt iron, and they used that iron to create better, stronger farming tools. 5,000 years ago in Africa, they were forging iron tools to master their environment. That is just incredible. And then, of course, there's the Aksumite Empire in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. They achieved something completely astonishing: terraced agriculture carved right into high-altitude mountain slopes to prevent soil erosion and perfectly manage water flow. So why does this matter? Well, it comes down to 2 words: agricultural surplus. When a civilization like Axum can consistently grow way more food than it needs to immediately survive, it unlocks the whole shebang. It creates the precise conditions that allow a society to build monumental architecture, fund deep scholarship, develop complex art, and raise the powerful militaries needed to protect a massive ancient trading empire. This brings us to a foundational quote from historian Walter Rodney that's heavily highlighted in our source material. He notes, African peoples had developed sophisticated economic and agricultural systems long before European contact. The documentary really stresses that the evidence for this isn't just theoretical, it's right there in the ground. It is literally built into the ruins of the Hafirs, the mountain terraces of Axum, and those meticulously kept records of the Nilometers. It's an undeniable, unbroken chain of innovation.
Section 2, Colonial Disruption and its Devastating Impact.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact mechanics of that disruption. In the 19th century, European colonial powers arrived in Africa with a very distinct need for land, for labor, and for resources to fuel their own industrial revolutions back home. On the left here, you have the ancient basin irrigation. It's perfectly sustainable, heavily reliant on natural silt, and completely chemical-free. On the right, you have the colonial replacement, perennial irrigation. The British in Egypt, for instance, totally dismantled the ancient basins and built massive dams to keep the land artificially wet all year round. Why? To continuously grow cash crops like cotton for European textile mills. But without that annual flood of silt, the soil very quickly exhausted itself, and the entire system became hopelessly dependent on imported chemical fertilizers. 3,000. I want you to let that sink in for a second. The sustainable African basin irrigation system functioned perfectly, feeding incredibly massive populations without a single major breakdown for 3,000 years. Yet when colonial engineers stepped in and replaced it to serve foreign economic interests, that ancient, perfectly balanced system was completely dismantled and effectively destroyed in less than a single century.
The source breaks down exactly how this unfolded on the ground. In 1882, the British began heavily pushing those cotton cash crops. Eventually, the construction of the Aswan Dam permanently trapped the life-giving silt at the bottom of a huge reservoir, which essentially starved the soil downstream. Meanwhile, in Sudan, colonial policies actively stripped local farmers of their traditional land tenure, just handing it straight over to commercial export enterprises. The documentary reports that this systemic shift fundamentally transformed ancient, abundant breadbaskets into regions heavily dependent on imported food and foreign chemicals.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 3, the African Renaissance and the return to traditions. So the physical infrastructure of those ancient systems was dismantled, sure, but the knowledge itself, it wasn't destroyed. It was heavily suppressed, for sure, but it survived through oral traditions and the deep memory of local farming communities. Today, there's this really quiet, powerful revolution happening. Across the continent, modern African scientists and farmers are successfully looking to the past to basically save the future of their agriculture. Over in Ethiopia, they're reviving those ancient terracing techniques to actively combat drought and soil erosion. Down in the Sahel region, farmers are bringing back zai, these traditional water harvesting planting pits, and they are reclaiming degraded land at a scale that modern tech alone just cannot match. They're quite literally using ancient genius to solve incredibly modern problems.
This really brings us back to the core thesis of the documentary, which is perfectly summarized by scholar Cheikh Anta Diop. African civilization was the foundation of human progress, the product of African minds, African hands, and African innovation. The source material makes it unequivocally clear that these agricultural miracles were not just weird anomalies, and they certainly weren't the result of outside influences. They were deeply, fundamentally African achievements that quite literally fed the ancient world.
Which leaves us with a massive, total, paradigm-shifting question to ponder right here at the end. What other ancient African civilization do you think mainstream history has erased or just ignored? If a 3,000-year-old agricultural empire could be so quietly swept under the rug, what else is out there waiting to be relearned? I really hope this explainer has sparked your curiosity to dig deeper into these incredible hidden histories. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and hey, never stop questioning what you think you know.